The point of this episode, I think, is to get people into the mindset of not having your starting point being a post that you saw on Instagram, but actually starting from a scientific standpoint of valid metabolic panels that will set the baseline and give you a complete understanding of your health. Instead of, oh, I've got a fat belly, or oh, my blood pressure is too high, or oh, I'm pre-diabetic, or whatever.
Right.
It's not the piecemeal approach. It's
the whole body approach.
There we go.
I think the whole body approach is really where you want to go. Like when you go for your physical or you go for a checkup, you really do want to check your metabolism, because that's like ground control to major comp. Like that is your major checkup. It's the indication of your whole entire system.
Welcome to Fat Science. I'm Mark Wright, along with Andrea Taylor and Dr. Emily Cooper. Great to see you two.
Hello.
Hi.
All right, on the show this week, Metabolic Workup 101. Today, we're going to break down the essential lab tests that you need at the very start of your metabolic journey. Whether you're worried about weight, you might be concerned about diabetes, especially if you have a family history, or maybe you're just one of those people, you just want to know your numbers. So, Dr. Cooper, why do we start with a metabolic lab panel, and explain what that means?
Well, when we're evaluating the metabolism, we're going to kind of step back and think, what is the metabolism about? It is the system that allows us to produce any kind of energy for any type of tasks that our body needs to do, whether it's just internal things that we don't even know about that are just automatically happening to keep us healthy, such as, our heart beating, our brain cells working, or it's running a mile, or playing with your grandkids, or chasing after your kids. It's all of that are things that require our metabolism to be functioning at its best, basically. And so stepping back, when we think about evaluating the metabolism, it's not only going to be the lab work, because it really, would start, we always say, it starts with the patient and their history and what they are saying to us, because they're picking up a lot of sensations in their body and feedback that they're getting from their body when they try to do something. Do they have less energy when they're thinking they should have more energy if they start an exercise program, and yet they have less energy after? Or is something causing their heart to race when they eat a meal? So in any case, the starting point for any evaluation is going to be, what is the patient reporting? And that includes their family history and all of the risks. And so we take all that into consideration, and then looking deeper at objective markers and what we're seeing there. So the history that we're taking, that's called subjective, because that's just a conversation about what's happening. It's not a research project or a measurement. But then once we start collecting data, now we're getting into the objective data collection, which does include the lab work, but it could also include other types of metabolic testing or imaging and things like that too for the metabolism. So when we're thinking about the lab work, it could be like really extensive, because when you think about it, the metabolism is driven by so many factors, and then it also influences so many other factors. So if you want to see that full picture, you've really got to look in a lot of places.
I want to go back in time, and we have seen a massive shift when it comes to what the everyday family doc views in terms of metabolic syndrome, because it really was centered on calories in, calories out, and to an extent still is. But we have come so far, and you were that, they call it early adoption, early adopter back in the day of saying, no, it's not calories in, calories out. It's this.
Right.
How come it took so long for us to get to this point?
Well, I have to think, long ago when I first started looking at this information, I found that there was so much science there that people weren't paying attention to. And it's mainly because the messages are drowned out by the whole diet mentality and the diet industry And even just the simplicity of thinking that high body weight or diabetes is caused by just your lifestyle or just eating too much, you just should exercise. It sounds so simple. And so I think that was really attractive to people. And the research really wasn't getting enough attention that was out there telling us that this is actually due to metabolic dysfunction. There are these hormones involved. People that are experiencing this have glitches in their system, basically, and that there are medications out there that could address this. And so that was even, way back. And in fact, the information talked a lot about how certain activities and certain things people were doing could actually weaken the metabolism. And those were the very things that a lot of doctors were recommending to patients to deal with high body weight or diabetes, such as really low calorie, very low calorie diets, exercising while underfueled, all of that. And so I was very upset about it because I felt like I wanted to shout it out to say, stop lying to people about this. Let's get the truth out there. And that's why I turned to Andrea, who helped me so much, just figure out how I could make a difference without just pushing people's buttons or, I didn't really understand why everyone was so defensive about trying to kind of protect and defend the thinking, the diet thinking. I didn't really get it, like why they were so invested in that. But I think it came down to just like a tipping point, I guess, where more recently there's been just such a wider acceptance in the medical community. And I think some of it was driven by patients too, which is great because the patients kind of stood up and said, you've got to do better. And so I think that altogether it's shifted things in a positive direction now. To the point where we can talk freely about things that just 10 years ago, even having a podcast like this, we would have just been shut down.
Yeah.
But we feel now really uninhibited to talk about what the metabolic system is about and what kind of ways we have to assess it and treat it and tools to talk to your healthcare provider. So all of that is pretty new.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's also why I get mad, like when people say, "Oh, these are appetite-suppressing drugs," and I'm like, let's not talk about them like that. Let's talk about like what they really do. It's bigger than that. It's a bigger issue, and I'd like to, like when we first started talking. I mean, it was revolutionary. It was revolutionary thinking to me. I had never heard it. I'd never heard it from my doctor. I'd always been told, you eat too much. And I'm like, really? I was eating 800 calories a day. How is that too much? Like, I'm like starving over here. So I didn't understand it. And when you started talking about it, I'm like, yeah, that's me. That's me. That's me. And when you told me that it wasn't my fault, I mean, I have to say, it probably took about a year for that to fully sink into my head. At first, of course, I was like so relieved and so excited, but for it to really sink in and for me to understand, it probably took about a year or so to really fully embrace it and understand it and believe it and get with it. And it's the most freeing thing that has ever happened to me, and it's totally changed my life.
Right.
And there's been so much judgment over the years. And
To everybody.
I've always been fascinated. Humans love to morally judge other humans. When you look back at what the science said about mental illness, what the science said about addiction, what the science now says about metabolic dysfunction, this lag, it's the first thing is to morally judge. Oh, that person... I mean, insurance companies, in my professional lifetime as a journalist, insurance companies didn't used to cover mental illness as a medical condition in my professional lifetime.
Yeah.
Think about that, because it was somehow a moral failure or something.
Right.
But the establishment has, for a long time, just morally judged people for bona fide medical conditions. And I thank God that we're at the point now where we can talk about metabolic dysfunction. you know, but people still look at people who have a lot of excess body weight and look at them with judgment, like, oh, they should stop eating so much. They should just get out and exercise. But we know from all the episodes that we've done, we're up to 90 episodes now on this show, you can be training for a triathlon and eating 1,000 calories a day and still gain weight.
Right.
Right.
And there's no connection if you have that dysfunction. There's no connection between calories in and calories out.
That's right.
Right.
So-
But it's still hard to tell a lot of people that. Like there's still that programming in the world that says, don't eat, go on a diet. Like there still is that programming. I think it will take another generation to wipe that out. But
I think you're right.
At least we're on the right track.
Yeah, I think so. I think it'll take us, we still haven't gotten to that yet, but I have more hope we will because of where we are now. At that point of what Mark just said, that, and I used to get so beat up for saying this that I've kind of been conditioned not to say this, but that it's irrelevant,
Yes.
The calorie in, calorie out, it's irrelevant. Now that's very bold to say that. And I know that we'll get attacked for sure. And some of the people that attack are people with high body weight that are struggling with this. And they also are like buying into this. But I can understand it because you want to feel like you have control over this condition and that you can do something to change it just through your lifestyle. And everyone wants to feel empowered like that.
Right.
But we've talked about that you can be empowered to do certain things lifestyle wise that make you healthier. It's worth it. It's worth it focusing on lifestyle for health. But when it comes to metabolic dysfunction that causes obesity or diabetes, while lifestyle strategies can be helpful, they're not powerful enough to reverse the underlying dysfunction in the vast majority of cases. And so, in those cases, Andrea was just saying, I ate 800 calories and it's not doing anything. And some people are gaining weight. Look at Anna, who we talked about, who trained for the Ironman. She was eating too few calories and gaining a tremendous amount of weight while training for Ironman 20 hours a week. So in that case, it was irrelevant.
Right.
The calorie restriction she did was irrelevant with respect to whether or not it was going to have any power to change her weight. So we're not at that point yet where there's an acceptance of this because we still are clinging to the idea that these medications are, quote, weight loss medicines. These medications help people stay on a, quote, diet, that these medications train people to eat less so that when they go off of them, they'll know how to eat less.
Right.
I mean, I've heard that one.
Oh,
and
all the time.
So it's going to take, this is kind of new. And already we're getting letters from people that are super disappointed in what's happened in terms of they've been put on medication a certain way and diets and all that. And they started out feeling like they're making all this progress and now they're not. And they're wondering what's going on. And so I'm kind of just sitting back here waiting for time for the experience, the providers to get more experience with this and to see, because I always used to say, if you'd roll up your sleeves and get in there with the patients, you will see things that you weren't aware of. And it will become obvious why those diets and things are not going to work long term. And so if we're using these medicines, the funny thing is that there was a study, and some of our viewers really want more science posted, which is totally fine. We can definitely do that. There's a lot of science that backs up what we're talking about. And that's on me because I probably haven't done a good job of posting some of the links. But I'll put together some links about the effects of diets on your metabolism and things like that. But there was a landmark study long ago where it was an 18-month study where people were put on a short-term diet for, I think it was like 12 weeks. And it wasn't an extreme one. It was like a low calorie, not a very low calorie. And then they did exercise, but not extreme. And they measured their baseline metabolic markers, like some of the more advanced ones that we mentioned, ghrelin, and leptin and PYY. And there's just a lot of them that are players in how your metabolism works that were measured early on before they started the diet. And then they were measured after the diet. And they continued to measure them for 18 months after the diet was over. And these markers stayed in a position of biologic weight defense, meaning they were in a position where the person will gain weight, where they weren't in that position before they started the diet. So it was the body trying to recuperate from this diet. It never really did. It just thought that the body was starving. So all the hunger signals stayed elevated. The ones that say we're not hungry, we're not in a famine, stayed suppressed for 18 months. So I thought, oh, great, this is finally going to get people's attention. But the conclusion was, so the diets, quote, work because the people lost weight in that 12-week period. But what we need is something that will stop the body from regaining the weight after the diet, because these hormones are in a bad balance from the diet. And I'm thinking, that's the conclusion? I mean, wouldn't the conclusion be that the diets aren't the answer?
Right.
But now, fast forward where we are, that's how people are wanting to use these GLP-1, GIP medicines. They're wanting to take that mentality and continue to do the diet, which is causing those hormone shifts, but use the medication to try to cancel out the detrimental effect of the hormone shifts that happen with dieting. And that's only going to get you so far. And I think people are going to figure that out with time and experience with this. It's going to take experience because, remember, this isn't an overnight kind of thing. This is a multi-year process. But if we fast forward maybe 10 years, we may be at a point where people are willing to kind of speak out that we are doing it wrong by having the diets in this mix and emphasizing all this calorie restriction and this exercise that's underfueled. And then I think at that point, Andrea, we could say,
yeah,
it'll take a generation from there.
That's what I mean. That's what I think. It's like,
yeah.
It takes a full generation for these things to really sink in, unfortunately. But I think that we're on the way. There's definitely a shift. And I think, Mark, we had been talking about it, you were feeling it too. When I first started going to my doctor, when I first started working with Dr. Cooper, my doctor was like, what is this voodoo stuff that you're on? What are these drugs? Because I not only take the GLP-1, I have some other drugs that I take with it because my system is majorly messed up. And the GLP-1 drugs are not, how would you say it? They're not enough. How would you say it?
Yeah, and that's actually real common. I think it's quite rare to have any patient where GLP-1 alone is going to produce enough impact metabolically in the long run, where
right.
And if we rely heavily on one medicine, we're kind of limiting ourselves.
Right.
Basically.
Then you can't go up, down, and mixy match. So I have some other ones that are some
that help
odd,
other aspects.
Right. And they are some odd drugs that, people, like I said, I'm a product of science. So the doctor would look at it and go, what is this? And then, a few months later when weight came off and certain other things, cholesterol was great and fatty liver was gone and all these other, my A1C was amazing. And they're like, well, seems to be working. So I guess it's all right. Whatever she's doing. Okay.
And that's how it starts. I think that's how that tipping point starts is by, I tried to
proof of the pudding.
You try to I really have so much respect for patients like you, Andrea and Mark and others, who've been at this a long time, that were brave enough to stand up and be no, this, and explain things to their providers and things like that to try, but nowadays it's so much easier for patients because there's this acceptance now that, oh yes, even though it was 2015 that the guidelines came out saying that the use of pharmacologic treatment in obesity is recommended above and beyond not using pharmacologic treatment, which meant that's the gold standard. If you're not using pharmacologic treatment in obesity, you're substandard care. You're providing substandard care. That was in 2015. But yet people were getting all the pushback. Yeah, for even thinking that way. So I know that we're kind of getting off topic a little.
Yeah.
No, it's. I think it's a great baseline, and we'll get to what the basic metabolic panel is in just a second. But, you know, back when I first started seeing you, Dr. Cooper, I was having an annual physical, which included blood panels and all that stuff. My family doc didn't ever tell me, Mark, you're pre-diabetic. We just kind of had these conversations where he'd say, you know, everything's kind of going in the wrong direction. Try to eat better. Try to get more exercise. I was borderline bad in everything, maybe more than, my blood pressure was not borderline. It was high. And so let's talk about the basic, annual physical panel that our physicians do. Is that adequate to diagnose metabolic syndrome? And if not, what should be done? So take it from there, Dr. Cooper, about what kind of panels we should have to set the baseline.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good point. Evaluating the metabolism is so much more than just like the number on the scale, the BMI, because people look at that. Well, your metabolism I've evaluated it because your BMI is high or your BMI is low, and I'm judging you based on that. That we know doesn't work. We need to look much further than that. Glucose levels. But again, glucose without insulin levels don't tell you as much. So basic panels include glucose. But if it's not high, you might miss something. And if it's just on the fasting blood, you may miss something that could be going on after you eat. So the basic panel, though, we shouldn't knock it because at least it's something, and you can actually get a lot of clues from the basic panel. So basic panel would have liver function. So in previous episodes, we talked about fatty liver disease, but there are markers for your liver on the basic panel. There's, on the basic panel, usually a cholesterol profile that's not necessarily the advanced one looking at your particles, but it measures total cholesterol, HDL, LDL, and triglycerides. And that can give you clues, too, about somebody who has metabolic syndrome, because there's a tendency to have elevation of triglycerides and low HDL levels in people with like the metabolic syndrome, which is a specific type of metabolic dysfunction. So, now you've got glucose, you've got some things on the basic lipid panel, you have a blood pressure. Blood pressure can give you a clue also about metabolic syndrome. And there's kidney function typically, and you want to look at that. So there are some basics on that initial profile. And if they did run what's called a CBC, which is a complete blood count, you get your platelet level, which lets you calculate those scores to assess your liver health. So there's some markers on that basic one. But it's really not sufficient to really understand a person's risk and to be able to figure out what the best treatment for them really would be. So we would want to add other tests to that. And so in our clinic, for example, we do order the HbA1c, which is the 3-month glucose level. And these days, more and more people are checking that level. And the problem in the past, Mark, when you first came, was that you were getting some of these basic tests done, but you weren't being told, because you weren't in full-blown diabetes, you weren't told you had prediabetes. And you weren't told also that your triglycerides were high. And so combining these things that even on your basic panel, high blood pressure, high glucose, high triglycerides, that's already metabolic syndrome. So even on
any
that basic,
three of those metrics, right?
Any three. And so you were obvious even on the basic panel that there's something not right. But back when you did that assessment, 90% of people with prediabetes didn't know they had it. It was undiagnosed in 90%. And the studies showed that included people who, like you, who had been going to their doctor regularly and having these lab tests. And now it's improved. It's now 80%. So it's improved now, but it's still really not good. The basic panel can give you info, but only if, it's taken seriously, the results. But adding to that basic panel, the additional tests of like the advanced lipo profile that we test, where it looks at the particle counts for your cholesterol. We are even ordering now that test TMAO, which tells you a little bit about your microbiome health, since microbiome is involved in our metabolic health. And looking at things like that FIB4 score, which is the liver fibrosis indicator that can go with metabolic syndrome. Those are all important. We also look at the metabolic pathway from a standpoint of reproductive health, because the metabolism influences reproductive markers like testosterone and estrogen, but also the signals that come from the brain, which are the luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. In both men and women, those can help see what the brain is sending to the reproductive organs. And that plays into the metabolic system as well, like what is really the impression in the body of the metabolism, and of the nutritional security levels versus the hunger signals. So thyroid levels, and we go on and we do measure some of the hormones that come from the body fat that affect our metabolism and our health. Adiponectin, which is a really important one that reduces inflammation in our blood vessels. Because one of our viewers pointed out, and it was really good that they did, that our episode when we talked about the advanced lipo profile and the risk of LDL particle elevations, we did mention that inflammation is a risk, and it's the first thing that happens in the blood vessels, inflammation, that allows plaque to form. But maybe they felt we didn't spend enough time about the inflammation. So with our basic panel, we do order more inflammation markers to see HSCRP, to see if there's a lot of inflammation in the system. But the adiponectin from the body fat, it acts like an anti-inflammatory. And so it's a real important hormone to measure as well, to see if we have adequate numbers of that adiponectin. And leptin is the other important hormone from the body fat that helps tell our brain what we weigh and whether we're secure in that area. And so we look at the leptin to see if it's registering in a range that correlates with the actual weight. And we can even measure things like the famine signals coming from the brain, neuropeptide Y, agouti-related peptide, and then the signals that they can possibly influence that are called ACTH and alpha MSH. So it goes on and on. And you know what? You can even measure GLP-1 and GIP. But, the thing is, it comes down to what's practical and affordable as well. So these panels, you want to do an expanded panel, but maybe, not everything under the sun that you can measure, because it could end up driving the costs up. And maybe there's things that are so obvious on smaller panels of where your starting point is that you don't need all that additional info. So when it comes to labs, there's an awful lot of labs you can measure.
And then let's talk about how important the family history is, because like my family, everybody was on high blood pressure medicine pretty much. And I mean, I guess, did my dad have pre-diabetes? I think so. And I think my mother did too. But I mean, you really have to like ask your family those questions like, hey, what do you got? I mean, and it's weird because, I mean, nobody sits at Thanksgiving talking about, well, is grandpa pre-diabetic? Is this one? I mean, I didn't find out that my mother had gestational diabetes until I was probably like 40-something. And she was like, oh, yeah, I had that. I mean, I think it was when I came to see you and we were talking about it, and you one time told me that that was like a factor. Yeah. And she said, oh, yeah, I had that. And I was like, oh, thanks for telling me. But, I mean, you don't know these things because your family doesn't talk about them over dinner.
Well, yeah. And also, like, the doctors don't often mention it. So, like, with your mom, gestational diabetes, now, back then, maybe they didn't really fully understand the risks of that.
Well, she
But
was smoking and drinking during her pregnancy too. So I
oh
mean, who
well,
knows?
let's not go into that.
Which was more common back then, right? Yeah.
I mean,
It
there's
was
a
more
great
common.
picture of her and all her friends having martinis. I mean, while
With
they
a
were
cigarette
pregnant.
in their
So
Oh
hand.
boy.
it could explain a lot of things about me, but I don't think they smoke. I don't think they were smoking, maybe, but they do. It is a picture of all of them with big, huge bellies, like in their 9th month with
Oh my
martinis.
gosh.
Oh boy. Well, yeah,
Oh
and
well.
it's, sometimes though, even today, gestational diabetes is a risk factor for both the mom and the offspring. The mom, it significantly increases their risk of developing diabetes as an adult, and the offspring increases risk of diabetes and obesity. So, but doctors often, even though they know about the gestational diabetes, they don't continue on with screening of that person, and so that's where knowing that history really helps,
Right.
because you can kind of help see this person is at risk
Yeah.
genetically,
But I've
more
never had
so.
that. I've never had that on a questionnaire.
Yeah. And we ask that, of our new patients. And that's why I was saying the
Yeah.
history is really important to like go back all the way to birth history and all of that. But if you think about things that are not lab work too, that are part of the workup, you think about, everyone focuses on number on the scale. But remember the BMI, which is just height weight ratio, it's not really helpful. What we want to be looking at is that body fat distribution, if possible. Like, where is the body fat? Is
You
it
mean
in
like
the
the
sub?
apple versus pear
Yeah.
versus square
Yeah.
body thing?
That's like a general, but it's not that scientific. I mean, it correlates somewhat, but I think getting more technical would be good if possible to determine. And sometimes you can just determine that from just how the organ function is working. Like if there is something going on in the liver that indicates that liver fat, then it's visceral, that there is organ fat. The DEXA scanning for body composition does give you some sense of visceral fat component. And there are other ways to measure the visceral fat too that are more high tech and more expensive. So measuring the body fat percent, so that would be just how much fat is in the body, that can be done through different methods. Some of them are not that accurate. So if you think about like skin fold measurements that are calipers that trainers do, they can be pretty accurate, but it depends on the experience level of the person doing it. And so unless they're super experienced, those are not very accurate.
What about
And
those
then
scales?
the
Those scales
scales
that you
use,
can buy,
right,
like
those use
that tell you?
bioelectric impedance, and those are not too accurate because they're influenced a lot by, like, if you're eating a low carb diet, it overestimates the body fat. And if you're hydrated, it swings with your hydration and whether you've eaten or you haven't eaten, and whether you have glycogen stores or you don't. So that's not the best. I mean, if you're using it to measure trends, maybe it's okay, but not for accuracy. And then techniques like the hydrostatic weighing, where you go underwater and you're weighed on land and then under the water. That's like water displacement. And that is very accurate as long as you're a good swimmer, like you know how to empty your lungs completely, because you have to get all the air out of your lungs when you're under the water. So that's prone to some error, because what if you don't get all the air out of your lungs? Then it influences it. And then there's the bod pod, which is the same kind of concept, but it's with air displacement. And that one is pretty similar to the hydrostatic one. It does require you to breathe a certain way to get a super accurate reading. But I'd say hydrostatic weighing and the bod pod are both pretty good, pretty accurate. And the DEXA scan is the gold standard. So that's the one that's like recommended the most, because it does give you the body fat percentage, but it also does give you some insight into the distribution of the body fat too. So those would be like the main ways to test if you want to know about body fat. And then, getting more detailed with looking at ultrasounds or MRI to look at where the fat is, if it's in the organs. And that's not that practical unless you're at risk for fatty liver disease, which then you would look closer at the liver. But and there's some other tests too, like that are not lab tests that can be run. And there's some flaws with some of those too. Like, for example, testing the metabolism is kind of popular, like doing metabolic testing. And so that can also be done, but there are some issues that can happen with that.
Interesting. So they're actually trying to measure how you burn calories, or what is that?
Yes, it's a method called indirect calorimetry. And in the past, it's used like in burn units and places, trauma centers, where in the hospital, the dietitians need to know like how much to feed you to help you heal. And so it's a way to measure how much you're burning metabolically. And it does it by applying some type of a mask that you breathe in and out from. And so it's measuring the amount of oxygen or air, room air that you're taking in, and how much oxygen in the room air. We know how much oxygen's in room air. So then based on that, how much we're bouncing back out of the body. So when we exhale, what's the oxygen content there and the carbon dioxide content. And based on that, you can tell how much fuel the body is burning, because we use oxygen to burn fuel. And so it's called oxygen consumption. And then based on the ratio of the carbon dioxide to oxygen, you can kind of tell which fuel is being burned, if it's carbohydrates or it's fats. And you can extrapolate to the number of calories that are being burned per minute type of thing. And so this is a technology that's also applied in medicine and in sports science. So measuring that can be measured at rest. And it's a snapshot. So usually when it's measured at rest, it's like a 15-minute test. And it gives you a sense of, at rest, what the body's burning. Now, my problem with that is it's a snapshot. And so often some people will take that information and actually use it to prescribe how many calories you should eat. And that is where the flaw lies. I mean, I think it's a good test to do as an observation, but it wouldn't be a very good test to use to guide how many calories you're supposed to be eating throughout a day. Because remember our metabolism, if we undereat, our metabolism slows down to adapt to that. And if we eat a little more, it speeds up to adapt to that. So if we're getting a resting metabolism test and it's showing a low amount of calories because we're just not eating enough, and then we tell a person to reduce from there to try to, quote, lose weight and knock that down more, then next time you measure that resting metabolism, you're going to see that the metabolism has slowed down now more. So I think the way it's being used doesn't make sense. But where it is really helpful is in exercise metabolism. So if you can have someone do a test like on a treadmill or a bike with increasing exercise loads to try to assess their fitness capacity, that also gives you the information as you go higher on your intensity, your calorie burning increases, and what are you utilizing? Your carbohydrate utilization is what should increase. But if we see that it's not, it could mean that either you're not eating enough carbs and don't have them stored in your muscle, or something with your exercise training is off. So that does help, because it gives people a sense of, oh, this workout is costing me this much energy. So that means I have to add that much to my normal daily nutrition. So sometimes we use that to work with the dietitian to give them that advice as to where to target for the workouts based on, what we're measuring for that particular patient. And so if we have a very athletic patient and we're worried they're not consuming enough fuel, having this information helps them understand that the energy cost of that workout is X amount. And so if you want to do that exercise, you need to make sure you're fueling that adequately. So that is still like part of a metabolic assessment, and it's not necessary in every patient, of course, and it's not accessible to every patient, but it does provide some insight.
Okay, so we've got to wrap up. But a really quick question, Dr. Cooper, should the thyroid panel be part of the metabolic workup?
Oh, yes. If I left that out, yep, it definitely should be part of the workup. And if we see some kind of suspicion in the thyroid panel, it's good to look a little further at what are called thyroid antibodies. The most common cause of a sluggish thyroid would be autoimmune thyroid disease, which runs in families. And so that can usually be picked up by seeing elevated thyroid antibodies. And so you would measure the antibodies and maybe even iodine levels. But also sometimes imbalances of the thyroid or the reproductive hormones, it's really just because of the metabolic dysfunction that's there. And so sometimes it's good to get those baselines and then keep monitoring as you're applying some kind of a metabolic treatment.
Wow, this has been just an amazing...
A lot of tests.
There's
a lot of tests.
A lot of stuff there. But I think, the takeaway from my perspective is, as someone who lived through this, if you're borderline in several areas, don't just accept that it's going to somehow get better. I mean, if you're borderline in any area, there's a problem and there's a reason. And I just think that we just have to educate ourselves, and we have to ask our providers questions, and we can't be satisfied with, well, just eat a little better and exercise a little more. That is not the answer if you have metabolic dysfunction. So, Andrea, a quick takeaway from you, and then Dr. Cooper.
I would say just, it's not like if you get bad results or what's labeled as bad results or whatever, it's not the end. It's really like there's so many great things that are being invented every day and developed every day that you really can get better. I mean, I'm like the result of somebody who got better, and there's a lot of hope out there. And I say to my friends all the time who have issues, it's like, go to the doctor, get some help. It can happen. Like, you really can get better. And it's not that hard to get better. Yeah. I mean, and this was the easiest get better I've ever gotten better.
And medication is not a failure. I talk to a lot of people who say, yeah, I just don't really want to get on blood pressure meds.
It's so weird.
Blood pressure meds.
It's like if you had a headache, you would take an asprin. It's like, you have a problem, get help.
Yeah, very true. All right, final word, Dr. Cooper.
Yeah, I think it's just like, and these tests we're talking about are baseline, so they're just like the beginning of trying to identify any risk. And it might be that leads you down a path of further workup. For example, say your lipo profile looks like high risk. Well, there's the coronary artery calcium score. Say your FIB4 score or your liver enzymes look odd, then there's that FibroScan. And so it's always looking at this baseline and making sure to do a thorough evaluation, because that's part of preventive medicine. As Andrea said, catching stuff early, that's the key, because that's when it's really reversible. And so, and I think that we want to make sure that we don't leave out the normal weight people, because they also are affected. And so everyone, regardless of body weight, should get that same workup to try to figure out, where they stand and address all those possible risk factors to prevent things from going into a really bad place in the future where it can't be reversed.
Don't be afraid to go to the doc. I just went to a memorial service for a friend who died from a heart attack at my age. And so what you don't know can kill you. It really can. Mm-hmm. So the more that we know about this stuff, the more that we can do to treat it. And the outcome is going to be way better than ignoring it. So.
And it doesn't hurt.
Yeah. Andrea.
It doesn't hurt. It really
well, that's a great
hurt.
place to end. Thank you so much, you two, for another edition of Fat Science.
No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.